Good morning, everybody. This is Tony Chicatel. I'm staff attorney with California Advocates for Nursing Home Reform. I'm glad you could join us for this town hall on the state of visitation rights in long-term care facilities. We're just going to wait a few seconds to get everybody out of the waiting room. Got a lot of people joining here last minute, which is good. All right, a couple things at the top. Please keep yourself muted as much as possible. Check right now to make sure you're muted. If not, please do so. At some point, we will open this up for questions and comments and things like that. And at that point, feel free to unmute yourself, but be very careful to remute yourself when you're done speaking. And one other sort of admonition is to make sure that when we do go to public comment that we are very respectful of the time of each other. In prior town halls, we've had a couple people who sort of went on soliloquies about their own personal cases, taking 5 or 10 minutes of the group's time. We definitely want a lot of discussion, but please try to keep comments and questions brief. I suspect that many of you will have the same questions and complaints about the state of visitation. So I think we won't have much need to go into a lot of detail on facts. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of a history of where we are with visitation since COVID-19 started happening in nursing homes. Prior to COVID-19, and I think this is really important that we all understand what the baseline is that in nursing homes, residents have a very robust right to visitation from anybody of their choosing. And if it's family members, there's really no visitation hours. Family members were expected to have 24-hour, 7 days a week access to residents, and residents were expected to have 24/7 access to visitors of their choosing. In assisted living facilities, it's a little different. Although the rights are still robust, assisted living facilities, what we call RCFEs, residential care facilities for the elderly, they're allowed to have reasonable visitation hours in most cases, but still that should be 7 days a week with many, many hours. When COVID-19 happened, one of the very first things that happened in the nursing home world was visitors were essentially locked out. I think this happened March 16th, I want to say, of 2020. And we went through a very difficult few months where visitors were just not there in facilities. California was actually a leader in expanding visitation in nursing homes anyway. They were the first state that I know of that mandated any form of, that returned to a mandate for visitation of any form back in June of 2020 when they mandated outdoor visitation be made available to all nursing home residents. And I know that we had compliance issues with facilities. We've had compliance issues with facilities on every iteration of the federal and state guidance on visitation since March, or since we started like peeling back the lockout starting in June 2020. But that's when we first started coming out. And then in, I think it was September of 2020, California mandated indoor visitation be made available to residents in facilities where there were no current COVID outbreaks. And I think there were also some requirements related to the county percentages of positive test rates and stuff like that. So that was the first that I know of state in the country to have some sort of mandated indoor visitation. And then shortly thereafter, there was some requirements for in-room visitation. That was sort of the next step. This was all in the fall of 2020. And then of course we had a huge surge and things kind of went backwards for a while. Then we had the vaccinations about a year ago, really started to accelerate Christmas, New Year's of last year. And then there was some pressure to reopen visitation. And we got something like that in April of 2021, where we were much more robust, supposed to be much more robust visitation. The problem has been, at least in nursing homes, that the state guidance has put in that 30 minutes would be the minimum for a visitation duration. And of course, a lot of facilities saw that as the max. Since the state says we have to require at least 30 minutes per visit, that's all we're going to provide. And we've been pushing the state to expand that out, but it hasn't happened. We've been very frustrated. This is no understatement. This has probably been the most frustrating issue I've ever dealt with in long-term care, at least on a short-term, relatively short-term basis. And the problem is we have so many differing sets of rules. We have the federal government who's releasing guidance and has their own laws and regulations. We have the state that's issuing its guidance and regulations that are built off of different state regulations. And then, which is unusual to the nursing home world, we have local public health departments, county public health departments, city public health departments with their own set of rules on nursing home visitation. So we have 3 layers of government bureaucracy. In addition to that, we have constant evolutions within the federal guidance, within the state guidance, within the local guidance. At the state level, we have at least 9 iterations of the state guidance on visitation to nursing homes since March of 2020. 9 different documents that update the guidance on visitation. At the local level, there's been a lot of fluctuation. At the federal level, we probably had 5 or 6 iterations of the guidance. So there's a lot of confusion, and I think that it's been to the detriment, obviously, of residents and facilities. They don't know what rules to follow and when. I'm gonna try to clarify that where we are today. Let's see here. All right, let me go through where we are today. Let's start with the federal government. 2.5 weeks ago or so, CMS released a new updated memo that required basically that we return to a robust, the state law or the federal law regarding visitation. So there's no more limitations on the frequency of visits. This is all under the federal guidance. There's no more limiting the duration of the visits. There's no more limiting the number of visitors that are allowed to see a resident on a particular visit. Facilities cannot confine visits to a certain number of hours in the day. There's 24-hour access for family members again. And then I think this is a big one, no requiring advanced scheduling of visits. I know a lot of you are saying that's not what's happening in my community or where my loved one is, but I just want to set out what the guidance says. It was a watershed evolution in the federal guidance that happened on, I think it was November 12th. So what happened with the federal guidance was not matched yet with the state guidance. The state guidance currently is stuck in April of 2021. The only real development that's happened at the state level on the guidance is that visits have become more restrictive in terms of requiring visitors to have proof of vaccination to get a visit or proof of a negative test within the last 72 hours to get a visit. It's interesting to note that the new CMS guidance says that facilities cannot require visitors to present proof of vaccination or negative test results. But so there's a split there on the state and the federal guidance, as there is in many places in the new federal guidance. So the state guidance still says this thing about a minimum 30-minute visits. It allows facilities to continue to restrict the number of visitors, the time for visits. So they still require, facilities can still require advanced scheduling under the current state guidance. And then what we've seen at the local level primarily is that the local governments are aligning themselves with the state guidance. So we've got the situation where the federal guidance is very open now in nursing homes. The state guidance is still somewhat restricted, gives facilities a lot of ability to tell visitors that they cannot come and visit or that they can only have their visits on certain days with advanced scheduling, and that only a certain number of visitors are allowed at a particular time. And the local governments back up the state guidance. I have yet to see a local government guidance that is significantly more restrictive than the state guidance. If anybody out there has an example, I'd like to hear about it. I just reviewed the LA guidance, and it has some elements that are different from the state guidance, but it's pretty much in spirit the same as the state guidance. And one of the problems we've had for many, many months, if not for years now, is that facilities are ignoring the state guidance. Now, I know the federal guidance is much better in terms of openness for visitation, but we still have a problem where the facilities aren't even following the state rules. And we've had issues with the Department of Public Health not doing a lot of robust enforcement of its own rules. So I want to get to what I think all of you are here for, which is to discuss what happens if your facility is not following the federal guidance or even the state guidance. Here's my suggestions. One, and a lot of these have been consistent since last year. One, you have to request the policy. What is the visitation policy of this facility? Request it in writing. Put your request in writing, and in your request, ask for their policy in writing. And if they don't have a written policy, get them to somehow put it into an email maybe. If they don't want to put it in an email, then you can tell them, this is what I think your policy is. Where am I right? Where am I wrong? And get them to give you some sort of confirmation in response. So lock them down on what their policy is as it is right now. This goes for nursing homes and assisted living facilities. If the facility is saying that they are, if they're complying with the state or local guidance, particularly if they're saying that they're complying with the local guidance, check it out. Actually look up what the local guidance is and see if it is materially different from the state guidance. I think a lot of facilities are hiding behind mysterious, undefined local guidance as an excuse for not providing robust visitation that certainly the federal government's requiring, and at some level the state government's requiring. Look it up. Look up the local guidance, print it out, highlight it, underline it, send it back to the facility and say, where in here does it say that residents only get one visit per week? Because that's not the policy. That's not the policy in any county that I know of. So force them to look at it and to reply to that. Once you've got their policy in writing and you've looked up the local guidance, and again, if the local guidance is much more restrictive than the state guidance, or even semi more restrictive than the state guidance, let me know about it. So I think that's an issue we would want to take up with that local government and ask them why they're so restrictive on their visitation policy. The next step is to file a complaint with Department of Public Health or Community Care Licensing. And I know for those of you who have already filed complaints on visitation or other issues in the past, you may find that that's not the most fruitful effort, but I think it's important. I think it's important that every facility that has policies that are not aligned with the state or local guidance, and at this point, the federal guidance, should be the subject of a complaint. The complaint numbers matter. And if you don't get a good result to your complaint, you can file for what's called an informal conference. And I encourage you to do that. I filed a complaint about a facility's very restrictive visitation policy back in April of 2021. Initially, the state came back and found no deficiencies. So the state said was that the facility's policies were compliant with the state and local rules at that particular time. I asked for an informal conference. I got that informal conference about a month ago, and we prevailed. And the facility was cited for having policies that were overly restrictive back in April of 2021. At this particular facility, they were only allowing 3 visits in the entire facility per day. So 3 residents got 1 visit per day, and with the number of residents in the facility, you basically had to wait about 3 weeks for your next visit. I thought that was entirely too restrictive. The state eventually agreed. It took a little while, but eventually they agreed. And I think it's going to make a difference ultimately for the residents and the families in that facility. So informal conference, they're very easy to get. It's not that complicated. You just make your arguments that the facility was in violation when you filed your complaint. The next step, and this and these don't have to run, you don't have to run these, you don't have to exhaust all these options before you move on to the next one. But another option is filing a lawsuit. And I want everybody to think about this. I've actually put out the word to a number of attorneys that CANHR associates with, asking them for their willingness to file lawsuits on behalf of family members who are subjected to overly restrictive visitation policies. And I've had some positive responses. Not as overwhelming as I would have liked, but I've had some positive responses. So if we have, and this sort of gets to another issue, we have the situation where the federal government has said residents are essentially allowed visitors, unlimited duration, unlimited frequency, and they don't have to advance schedule that. The state in this situation is an agent of the federal government. California gets millions and millions and millions of, I think it's billions of dollars to do the federal government's work in enforcing federal rules as it relates to skilled nursing facilities. California is the agent, the enforcement agent arm of the federal government. They're on a contract. And the state has told us this themselves. They are bound to enforce the federal guidance. So even though the state has sat on its hands the last couple of weeks, and I suspect they're going to sit on their hands for several more weeks, if not months, and not update their guidance, they are required under the terms of their contract to enforce the federal nursing home guidance on robust visitation. So that all the complaints that you file should be, if they're legit, if the facility is not following the federal guidance and the local guidance, and they're not following the local guide, I do think the local guidance prevails. So we're going to have to work around that. But if they're not compliant with what we got at the local level and at the federal level, then that should be worth a substantiated complaint. And it can also be the subject of a lawsuit. If a facility is not aligned, if they're not following the visitation policies that are set forth by the local government and the federal government, they can be sued. And I think we're at the point now where we need to start suing nursing homes, because honestly, the feds in the state are not doing much robust enforcement. Another thing I want to encourage you to do, everybody, is to email, write letters, make phone calls, and raise hell to our policymakers. Right now, the state has waited more than 2 weeks to align its policy with the federal government. Facilities are waiting for them to do that. Residents are waiting for them to do that. Family members, friends of residents are waiting for them to do that, and they've not done it. And I think it's really inexcusable that they've waited this long. So I'm going to give you the names of 2 people at California Department of Public Health that you should be bothering and urging them to align the state guidance with the federal guidance now. Okay, so the first one is Cassie Dunham. Cassie's email is CASSIE .Dunham, DUNHAM at cdph.ca.gov. So it's Cassie, CASSIE .Dunham, DUNHAM at cdph.ca.gov. And then the other person at DPH is Chelsea Driscoll, and her email address follows the same format: first name dot last name at cdph.ca.gov. Her first name is spelled CHELSEA, and her last name is DRISCOLL, Driscoll. So it's CHELSEA .Driscoll, DRISCOLL at cdph.ca.gov. And the reason why I didn't put that in the chat is because I expect a lot of people are going to watch this recording and they won't be able to see the chat in the recording. Also, talk to legislators. We're hoping that the legislature will have a bill this year in 2022, this upcoming year, to address the issue of visitation and long-term care facilities during a public health emergency, and to make sure that all residents have access to an essential caregiver, regardless of a public health emergency. But legislators need to know that the state has been very, very slow in aligning itself with the federal guidance. The federal government has said we are at a point now where the safety provided by vaccinations, and there's very high vaccination rates in California nursing homes, both among the staff and among the residents, has turned the tide and has made it such that the risk of COVID is substantially lower in terms of the health impacts of residents. And it's time to go back to robust visitation, because visitation is so important to the health and safety of our residents. And the state of California is dragging its feet and recognizing these developments. So legislators should know this. The governor should know this. Contact your legislator, your state assembly person, your state senator, and I think the governor's office ought to know, in addition to the people at the Department of Public Health, that you're urging to align the state policy with the federal policy. I suspect that in assisted living facilities, they're really waiting DPH's lead on this. Ever since the pandemic started, the visitation policies of DPH on the nursing home side and the Department of Social Services on the assisted living side, they've been working together on that, and the assisted living facilities are following the Department of Public Health's lead. Unfortunately, in assisted living, we don't have federal guidance. Assisted living facilities are creatures of the state licensing system. There's not much federal oversight. So all the rules are coming from the State Department of Social Services, and there's been no new developments in the guidance in assisted living facilities. So they're essentially under the state rules on nursing homes, which is pre-scheduled visits, but there still should be very robust visitation in assisted living facilities. And if anybody has concerns about that, they should file complaints with community care licensing and get on top of the policy leaders at the Department of Social Services to update their guidance, although I think it's probably a little premature until after Department of Public Health has updated its guidance. Mike, do you want to add anything? Anybody else from CANHR want to add anything? Mike, you're on mute.
There's a number of questions in the chat we can get to in a few minutes when you're ready, Tony.
Okay, is there anything you want to add to what I just said? I kind of know I was all over the map.
No, a couple of people have asked us to post those email addresses in the chat, so we'll do that before the end.
I've posted them already, Mike.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, what are the questions? Can you fire some questions at me?
Yes, one of the first questions was, I think you've already sort of begun to address, what lawsuits are we working on to deal with these ridiculous mandates?
The vaccination mandate for visitors, we're not working on any lawsuits there. I feel like that would be kind of spitting in the wind. I suspect that, so I've had very little input from the public objecting to the idea of having visitors vaccinated or having proof of a negative test result. I know the CMS guidance says that facilities cannot require that. I don't know how a judge would turn out on that. If the state wanted to say, well, we want to be extra protective, I think that I'm not sure what would prevail there on the federal state argument on who has the right to control that issue. But that's something that CANHR is not really focused on in terms of access to visitation. We're really focused on the getting as many visitors in as possible. And that's one thing I wanted to mention, is that what I think visitors ought to be very careful to do, and so far I think have been very careful to do, is to follow all the infection prevention protocols in a particular facility in terms of keeping your masks on, not going into other people's rooms, keeping your visits just between you and the person you're visiting, getting your temperature checked, all those things and hand washing, all those kinds of things that we've been doing since the start of the pandemic. I would hate to see any slipping on those following those protocols because now we figure like, hey, the federal government's cleared us. It's back to the old days and we can do visits the way we used to do visits. I think that would be a recipe for getting us set back and getting visitation restricted again. So definitely you want to follow all infection control protocols. And I think it's a logical, a reasonable thing to request that visitors have either proof of vaccination or proof of a negative test. The federal government may disagree, but I don't think we're going to get very far in California arguing against that.
Another question is, where do we file complaints?
Okay, yeah, definitely on the nursing home side, you're filing complaints with the Department of Public Health. On the assisted living side, you're filing complaints with the Department of Social Services, their Community Care Licensing Division. And on our website, CANHR.org, you can find information on how to file complaints. You can find the local office, the phone number to call, the email to send your complaint to. We definitely recommend that you put all of your complaints in writing so you have a good documentary trail. Both the Department of Social Services and the Department of Public Health are pretty notorious for you filing a complaint where you mention 5 or 6 different things and they only investigate 1 or 2 of them. And where's your proof that you filed your complaint on 5 or 6 things? Well, if you called it in, you don't have any proof and you're going to have to refile. So get your complaints in writing. On the CANHR website, we have a form that you can use just to give you some guidance on what your complaint should look like. And then you can print it out, fill it in, or just use it to create your own complaint and send those complaints into the Department of Social Services or Department of Public Health using the instructions we have on our website.
Okay, and we have a related question. Can we request informal conferences from both CDPH and CCL, both SNFs and
Yeah.
RCs?
That's a good question. The informal conference is a policy at the Department of Public Health. There is no policy within community care licensing for appealing a complaint that you're unsatisfied with. But in my experience, community care licensing is responsive. If you are upset with the outcome of your complaint, you can, again, I suggest you do this in writing. You say, hey, I'm dissatisfied with the outcome of my complaint. I want an appeal. And while they don't have the best formal procedure for the appeal hearing, you often get heard. And my experience, I've had success in getting a second look and getting a more satisfactory result on a complaint investigation. So you don't actually get an informal conference where you have the facility and you sort of arguing on whether the facility should have been subjected to enforcement action, but you can get something like that if you're just persistent with community care licensing.
Good, thanks. Next one is, I still haven't got my report. This is not a question, it's more a comment. I still haven't gotten my report from CCL from 1.5 years ago. Presumably that was based on a complaint filed with CCL.
Yeah, so we have a long history of community care licensing in particular not being very responsive in writing on complaint investigation results. You just have to stay on top of them. And I think making phone calls is almost a waste of time. You've got to put this stuff in writing. And if you're getting no response, you gotta move it up a level. You got to go to district office managers, district office directors, regional office managers, and regional office directors. And if you're not getting a response there, then you go to Sacramento. These are things that we can talk about. You can talk about with any CANHR advocate. Just give us a call and we can suggest who you would take this up to next.
Okay, there's another question that has to deal with visiting residents who have roommates. It says, how does new federal guidance addressing visiting residents who have roommates? Facilities are still not allowing any in-room visits for residents who have roommates.
Well, yeah, if you got a, and I think this is consistent with the most recent state guidance as well. Facilities are supposed to be accommodating of in-room visits as much as possible. The federal guidance says if the resident's roommate is vaccinated, there should be no problems. On the state side, I don't think it's quite that broad, but for a facility to have a policy that anybody with a roommate doesn't get an in-room visit is ridiculous. That's not accommodating. I think roommates should be allowed to choose their level of risk assumption. If they're both vaccinated, hey, would you allow me to have some visits in room and you can have some visits in room? I think residents are allowed to make those agreements, certainly. If they can waive whatever right they have to safety concerns that the state or the local government think that they have. I just think a blanket policy is not going to be consistent with the guidance. If the resident opposes, I mean, obviously it's a sort of a fact intense scenario. We would need to know what the roommate situation is. Can they leave the room for short periods of time during the course of a day? Is there outdoor visitations available? What's the access for the person who wants the visits to get visits outside of the room? I guess it depends on a lot of circumstances, but I think a blanket policy is obviously not legal.
Okay, and there's a comment here that the decision makers are more interested in keeping bodies alive than they are in keeping people's lives worth living.
Yeah, I mean, from the outset, this has all been about resident safety, and I think properly, that's obviously a very proper concern of the state and federal governments. What I've always had trouble with is the balance, and the policymakers seem to pay lip service to the idea that visitors were important for residents, but I think they had no clue as to how important visitors are, and it goes beyond just the psychological, I've got people visiting me, I've had a better day than I otherwise would have. It's care that these visitors often provide, essential care. Not only were they filling in gaps, they were part of the structure of care provision in a lot of facilities, and that all went missing starting March of 2020, and it's been very slow in coming back. And I think it's obvious that residents have suffered from a misalignment of the safety risk ratio and the balance of resident rights and their right to get care from people that they've always received care from. Mike, is there anything anybody from CANHR want to add anything to this stuff? I'm a little worried that I'm not giving a full broad perspective.
Well, maybe this would be a good time. There's been a couple of comments from relating to the Essential Caregiver Act about encouraging the right legislators relating to that. I don't know if Karen or Melody or anybody from Essential Caregivers wants to say a few words about that and where things are at with that legislation.
Hi, Karen from Essential Caregiver Coalition, and we were working on a federal Essential Caregivers Act, HR 3733, which we're still working on it. It just it too only covers those nursing homes that are federally funded facilities, not assisted living. And so if anybody wants to write their legislator about that, that's still in committee. And it would it says we don't encourage people to everybody to jump in and open the doors. This is two essential caregivers that that we consider essential to keep an eye on what's going on in there. And we would wear PPE, we would be trained, we would do what the staff is doing, but we would be allowed to let in the occurrence of another public health emergency, or as this one goes on, we would not be locked out again. And we think this is very, very important. And we're starting to work on another California bill, which we tried to do last year, but we know a lot more now. And so anybody wants to, jump on and help us with that, we've got a kind of put together. We're going to get it out to legislators and, in the next couple of weeks and month, and hopefully we can get that on the docket and start to, push for that bill, because, nobody should be locked away from their loved ones. And we found out what happened the last time. And I can personally say that, my mom, in memory care went downhill tremendously, in the time that she was isolated, and we just can't have that happen again. Melody just put our organization in the chat, and so that's very important. We have to still do that legislatively, even with the CMS thing, even with the federal bill. If that went through, we still have to have a California state bill, because we also want to include assisted livings and our CEFEs. And Melody, do you have anything else?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Good background. Hi, Melody Taylor Stark, and with Karen, and I think I see Lynn and Dr. Palmer on the call with Essential Caregivers Coalition. And as Karen was mentioning, there's two efforts going on right now. One of them is a national bill, HR 3733, the Essential Caregivers Act. That is a bipartisan bill. It was introduced in June, and we are working now with legislators, encouraging them to sign on to the bill. It is it's adjunct to the Social Security Act to reinforce the visitation rights. So that would be specific to nursing homes. However, it's a good start, and it's great language to begin with. So with that, we would encourage your House and Senate representatives to sign on to the bill. Within the last few months, our National Essential Caregivers Movement team put together a book called Protecting Them to Death. And there are stories from every single state in that book of people who were affected either by decline in health or death from failure to thrive from the isolation. And a copy of that book was sent to every single member of the House and every single member of the Senate. So for the national bill, we're encouraging people to call your representative. I was on a call not long ago with Judy Chu's office. Some of our members in Southern California, down near San Diego, with Representative Scott Peters. We've had contact with Nancy Pelosi's office. So we really encourage that part. And then, as Karen was mentioning, here in California, even though the national bill is in place, we need a state level bill. And what the state level bill will do is it will cover a broad spectrum of congregate living. So not just nursing homes, but assisted living, board and care, group homes. And also keeping in mind too that this is children as well as older adults. We tend to think of long-term care as older adults. There was a story in the newspaper probably about a year ago of a 1-year-old whose parents weren't allowed in for a year. So again, the intent of the bill is not to bust the doors down, but it's to say that everyone with their residence rights and also psychosocial, and even as was mentioned, with some of the physical health. So right now we have a team of us here in California who are working on getting a state bill going. And that's one of the reasons that I put my email for essential caregivers in the chat. If you'd like to help out with that, we have a draft that we can start sending out probably this week of the bill. And if you have any connections with legislators in California, any assembly members and so forth, that would be super helpful. And also, if you have any questions about that, please send me an email and I can either respond or get it out to one of our team members to help you out. So thank you. I appreciate that time, Tony and Mike and everyone on.
Thank you, Melody. And thanks to all the essential caregivers out there. You've been a wonderful voice for residents and for us as well, informing us as to what's going on in particular facilities around the state. Devorah, I see your hand up. Devorah, are you there? Well, Devorah, feel free to chime in when you want. I saw a couple of pretty good questions from Karen Jones.
I'm
Was the
sorry, it
one
was on
about-
mute.
Oh, go ahead, Devorah.
Good morning. I had a question and I wanted some feedback on some common concerns that happen in Kern County. So we absolutely encourage family members to file a complaint with CDPH, but one of the things that we have noticed is they have actually reopened cases, but I would like to know what their protocol is of their documentation when they have to reopen cases due to the fact that they basically confess that they are not well versed on the AFLs and substantiated or unsubstantiated, I should say unsubstantiated something due to the lack of them not having knowledge of it, hence why they had to reopen it. So it's not on record of a formal, the informal conference, but they just decided, oops, let's just reopen it. So is there something that they have to keep track so we can show that they are either prematurely unsubstantiating something or unsubstantiating complaints due to the fact that they basically are not well versed or trained on the AFLs that they're supposed to enforce?
Yeah, well, so I've in my experience, they only reopen a complaint after your informal conference. So they addressed your complaint. They say that the facility either violated or didn't violate, and I don't like the results. I asked for an informal conference, and in the vast majority of my informal conferences, what I get as a response is, okay, we're going to reopen the investigation, and they usually assign a new complaint number, has been my experience. And in most of those cases, then I get a different result on the new investigation. So I want to encourage everybody, file the complaints. If you don't like the outcome of the complaint, ask for your appeal. And at the Department of Public Health, that's called an informal conference. After the informal conference, if they reopen the complaint, you should consider that a success. That means that they're reconsidering the decision they made earlier, and hopefully they'll have a different outcome. And if you don't like that outcome, you can file another informal conference. What I'd be concerned about, Devorah, is the situation where the license, well, two things that you mentioned. One is that they might be just reopening the complaint to just buy more time and sort of maybe get you to go away, which I hope you wouldn't do. The other thing you mentioned is that they're not familiar with the AFL. The AFL is it's pretty straightforward. Facilities, I think the spirit of the AFL, even though it's not been updated to match the federal guidance, is that facilities should be bending over backwards to allow visitation as much as possible. And if a facility is telling you they don't have enough staff to accommodate the visitation that you want, then that's an understaffing complaint. That's a whole separate issue that you can complain about. So as I said, I've gone through this myself, where I filed for an informal conference and I made my best play that 3 visits per day for the entire facility was not enough. And on second thought, they reconsidered and issued a deficiency. So I want to just balance the questions and then what's from the people who want to ask verbally versus those that are in the chat. So I want to bring up the one from a couple from the chat. Karen Jones asked about SNFs saying that visitors are have been the cause of recent outbreaks. I'm not sure how they would be able to prove that conclusively, but assuming that they have some sort of proof as to that, of course, that's a risk. That's the whole reason why we stopped visitation in the first place, is that visitors could possibly bring in COVID-19. What we've got now from the federal government, and to some extent from the state government, is an acceptance of that risk, that it's going to happen, that a visitor with COVID is going to walk into that building. It's just, the sheer volume of 1,200 nursing homes in California times, we got 100,000 residents. That's a lot of visitors. But we know for a fact that up till now, the the overwhelming majority of outbreaks have been caused by staff. And we certainly didn't tell the staff that they couldn't come to work because they were a risk to the residents. Visitors bring benefits to the residents, and those benefits mean something. And in the calculation of the federal and state government, in light of the vaccination rates of the staff and the residents, is that this is a tolerable risk at this point. And I suspect that facilities are trying to use the idea that visitors are bringing in the virus to shut down visitation. Well, if they can convince their local public health authority of that, then I think then we need to advocate from the other side and argue that the visitors are bringing in so much benefit to the residents. Okay, Nancy Stevens, I see your hand. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I actually have a two-part question. Hi, Mike. It's nice to see you in person. I was wondering, outside care coordinators, what is their role, and what happens when the reach of staff at a facility or the administrator's reach, social worker in my case, is so far and really powerful, actually. I was told, for instance, I was told by an outside care coordinator, she stopped me mid-sentence and said, "Stop, I'm not going to listen to another bad word about Lisa. She's been my friend for a very long time." So I guess that those are my questions. What is the role of a care coordinator, an outside care coordinator? What can they do to help with visitation if someone has problems with that? And then what can I do when I keep coming across people who are friends with the social worker?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I'm not sure what you mean by care coordinator. Is this a staff person in the facility, and then an outside care coordinator is someone who's on a contract with the facility to provide some sort of service?
Yes, I'm not sure if they're on a contract or not, but I had contacted Partners in Care when I was put on sleep deprivation for no reason. And well, it was actually retaliatory for speaking up for my roommate who couldn't speak. And so I contacted the Partners in Care Foundation and had that happen with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, the extent of any particular staff person in the nursing home is limited by the state and federal regulatory structure. So that, I mean, facilities have the staff can do certain things in terms of recommending services and providing services that the resident accepts. But in terms of visitation, they only have the authority that the federal and state government give them. Normally, in pre-pandemic times, staff people really could not meaningfully restrict visitation unless you had a really extreme situation where a court had intervened or something. Since the pandemic, facilities have had wider berth to restrict visitation. Now the authority they have to restrict visitation has gotten smaller and smaller over time, and now at this point it's at its smallest ebb. So care coordinators, administrators, directors of nursing, they're limited by what the state and federal government say that they can do or can't do.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't have any authority to take away a resident's rights.
Okay. And then if an ombudsman is not able to persuade the administrator to open up for visitation, if the administrator is continuing to have, people make reservations and restrict it to 4 hours a day or, 30 minutes at a time, and only for some people, it's different for every person. It's so strange. In the facility I'm in, if the ombudsman is not having any movement, then what can we do to encourage the ombudsman to do more and not just give up?
Well, on this issue, I think the ombudsman should be seen as partners. They're certainly not the policy makers. They're not responsible for the policies that we have, but I think they could be very powerful partners
Yeah.
in raising these issues to the attention of Department of Public Health, Community Care Licensing, maybe they can
Okay.
maybe they could file the complaint on your behalf. Maybe they could be co-complainants with you, or any of the family members or residents, depending on their bandwidth, and try to help CANHR and other advocates, essential caregivers, in bringing problems that they see statewide and getting them addressed in statewide policies.
All right. Thank you so much.
Hi, Terry Palmer.
I wanted to you to help briefly with a few talking points about HR 3733, and which is the federal version of the Essential Caregivers Act, and the state version. I'm in the process of reaching out to both state and federal, and the question we're going to get is, why is it still necessary with the current CMS guidelines? And if you could just address that
Sure.
succinctly, I would appreciate, getting my head straight on this.
Yeah, no problem. So 3733 and the state legislation that we're hoping to get for 2022 would cover any public health emergency in the future. So let's say 20 years from now, there was another pandemic, a different virus, a different concern. Regardless of the public health emergency, the state and federal governments, if this legislation passes, would be prohibited from limiting visitation of essential caregivers. There would be this carve out for people who are identified as essential caregivers. This is really important stuff. Like, for example, Texas has adopted a essential caregiver law, and they amended their state constitution to get there, to ensure that a public health emergency would not override this very critical policy. So even though, if CMS's guidance was implemented by all the states and all the local governments today, would we have a need for 3733? The answer is absolutely, because we don't know. The Omicron variant, that's all I heard about over the weekend, is out there. There may be other variants out there, and the policies may regress. We may have visitation limitations imposed in the next few months based on variants. So stuff like 3733 and state legislation are really critical to ensure that regardless of what the scenario is, essential caregivers have access.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So I saw another question from Karen Jones about 2 bedbound residents who are roommates in the facility, saying that since neither can leave the room, the one resident cannot have in-room visits. And it sounds like maybe they can't have visits at all in person because they can't get this resident out of their room. I think that's the kind of scenario where we got to think about, is the facility bending over? The requirement is that they bend over backwards. It's not written that way, but the spirit of the rules are that they bend over backwards to accommodate visitation. Is there an open room anywhere? Is there maybe a potentially a room change where they switch the roommates? Has anybody asked the roommates if they're okay with the residents having visitation? Again, I think this is it's back to their right to waive or not. And then there's the issue of, are they both vaccinated? Those are unanswered questions. Are the visitors vaccinated? Those kinds of things I think would limit the risk. And you could argue that this resident gets in-room visits because there's no other way. Any other questions that I might be missing from the chat, Mike?
There's a lot of commentary about DPH not doing its job, and some people expressing concern that that the ombudsman are sometimes taking the sides of facilities rather than the residents.
Okay, Karen Klink.
So I have frustration here because you and I have had conversations about CMS should be the law of the land, even if California Department does not come out and put something out. So is that the message that we're getting, or or because it's confusing to people, because and it's confusing to me. should they complain? It doesn't make any sense. And then you're saying, oh, but if it's a local thing, then maybe that's a problem. However, I received information, and I told you from LA County, that they don't think that they're in competition with the CMS, but you have facilities that are saying they are, right? So if you have conflicting information, and like facilities in LA are saying, well, the LA department has to put something out saying that they're in alignment with CS, when the LA Department of Health thinks they're already in alignment, what do people do then? I mean,
Okay.
it
Yeah.
says, LA Department of Health says that they never had any restrictions as to frequency, duration, how many visitors, what day, how much time. So, but you have certain places, which I should probably really not say, but might say them, that are very huge facilities in Los Angeles County that are not aligning with that, and that will refuse to align with that until LA County comes out with something, which they won't until the California Department of Health comes out with it, which makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So I stick with what I said earlier in terms of the process that I recommend. I'm really sorry that this is.
That's too.
But please hear me out. I apologize that this is all still so confusing. There's a lot of, we got a lot of layers that we're working through here. What I think is that local governments have the right to control public health situations in their counties, and that may include visitation in skilled nursing facilities or long-term care facilities. So I think the local guidance prevails. CMS, what I've seen, what most local governments are doing now is they're saying we align with the state. They don't have the time to constantly update their policies, so it usually says something like, we go with what the state says. We're trying to get the state to align itself with a much more robust federal visitation guidance. But where we are now is, if you've got a situation where you're not getting the visitations you want, confront the facility. What is your policy right now? I want to see it in writing. I want to look at the local government guidance and see if their policy, the facility's policy, aligns with the local government policy. If it doesn't, and I submit in a lot of these cases, it won't, you file your complaint. If you don't get a good resolution on your complaint, you appeal it. During that time, you think about filing a lawsuit, and the way you're going to get that going is by calling me, by calling CANHR. And if we have a situation where the facility is not compliant with what we think the rules are, we will try to get you referred to an attorney to file a lawsuit. In the meantime, I want you all raising hell.
Well, I'm raising hell. But if the LA County Department says they're in alignment with CMS, but you have facilities that are saying, well, no, we don't think so. We're still going to only give 30 minutes every 2 weeks.
Right.
I got an email from
LA is not aligned with CMS right now. I just reviewed the LA guidance. It's not aligned with CMS. What it is aligned with is the old state guidance. But LA does not have anything about 30 minutes. So
I know.
30 minutes in LA is not going to fly. It's so you file your complaint, and if the facility says we're aligned, we follow the LA guidance, then you say, no, you don't. You're not compliant with the LA guidance, and you should be cited. And if you're not cited, then we'll try to get you sued.
Okay. Okay. I got an email from the CMS because I sent an email to Evan Schulman, and they basically said, if you have specific information regarding facilities that are not allowing visitation and or not complying with CMS guidelines, we recommend you send that information to the CDPH. Also, if you feel facilities continue not to comply with CMS guidelines, we recommend you reach out to the CMS San Francisco office. They give me an email, and then they also give me another email at the at the DNA triage team. If you have problems, so I will put that in the chat. That's what they said.
Yeah, please put that in the chat. And Karen, I'm really glad that you're expressing so much frustration, because I think we all feel the same way. I know that I do. This, again, this has been a very, very frustrating issue for all of us. And we're not, I feel like it's, sometimes we get little victories, but we're kind of winning some battles, but losing the war at this point. I think we've got to continue to fight. And that's what I do. That's all that I do. We continue to fight, we raise some hell, and eventually this will get fixed. We just got to make it sooner rather than later. All right, so we're at 11 o'clock. We set this up for 1 hour. I don't want to go over if there's no compelling reason to do that. Thank you all for participating. If you have any questions, individual cases you want to run by us, please give us a call. Please send us an email. My email address is tony@canhr.org, tony@canhr.org. Individual cases are important for us to know about, so please share them if you've got something that you think is worth noting. All right, take care, everybody. Be safe. Keep fighting.